Okay, so I am joined today by Brandon Sutton. And Brandon, just introduce yourself briefly because I don't feel like I will capture what it is that you do effectively.
I mean, I do so much, right? No, my name is Brandon, and I am the host of a podcast called The Discourse, which is, a relatively fledgling podcast. I suppose you would say it fits under like the newly formed genre of like dirtbag left podcast, but I'll try not to be super gross and, offensive since this is your platform. And
Let the dirtbag energy flow. That's what I say.
you say that, but it can be a little messy.
Okay.
I'm also affiliated with the Progressive Army. I'm under their network as well. And I mean, that's the long and short of it. The Discourse podcast is concerned with politics, popular culture, dick jokes. It's all, the trifecta, the holy trinity.
Yeah, so we will link to that in the description box of this video, so people should check that out if they so desire. Um, but I wanted to talk about just a general theme that's going on right now in American politics. And you and I kind of messaged about this privately, but there seems to be this new normal in U.S. political discourse where there's a crisis which is seemingly of epic proportions like every 48 hours. And people feel like they have to drop everything and follow closely along with developments around whatever this crisis is. I mean, obviously, Trump is a huge factor in feeding this tendency, and the Russia story has been a major component. But it even seems like it's now become sort of a cultural thing where there's this collective sensibility now about having to be immersed in politics on a regular basis. I was actually listening to the Sam Harris podcast. I don't agree with Sam.
Why?
Well, I mean, because I listen to podcasts from people across the spectrum,
Okay.
and
Okay.
he was, he's very much anti-Trump,
Yeah.
and he was complaining that one of the worst aspects of Trump is that it's caused kind of normal life in America to be much more politicized than it typically is. Now, that would be seen maybe even on elements of the left as a potentially a good thing, in that it raises consciousness, it gets people more involved. But Sam Harris saw that as a bad thing, and he didn't like how Trump's kind of overweening presence in everything somehow now compels people to, just think about politics much more than they would say 5 years ago in their everyday life. And I just wonder, is this is there any upside to this like feeling of constant crisis that we're lurching every 48 hours into another crisis that or or, or is it just this or is it just a cause of fatigue, and is it just making people numb, and is it just kind of like corroding our collective cognitive abilities? So what do you think?
All of the above, right? No, but so I think that you've identified something that's important, right? But not necessarily new. And that's American politics for at least the past decade has revolved around crisis. Like if we look back to the general election for, the best example, like the idea of Trump winning was an apocalyptic scenario. It was an end of the world scenario. And a lot of our politics are framed that way. Very reactive, very you have to vote now. You have to make the decision now. These are your two choices: vote, vote. You know, vote, vote. They don't. If you make the wrong choice, the world will end. Right? A large portion of America is not used to being politically engaged for long periods of time because what you call politics, and I guess we can call it democracy, right? Democracy as the general term for being engaged politically with the world around you and seeking to shape it through conversation and stuff like that. America tends to treat democracy like I don't know, a herpes flare up. Like every 4 years, we do democracy, and it's a big deal. We focus, everyone has to hyper focus on the primary or some big individual bill. And then like after that crisis is over, everyone is so fatigued from that process that they fall asleep for 4 more years. Then we do it over and over again, and that had just become the paradigm under which American politics exists within, and and both parties have fed that, right? Both parties have used that as a way to avoid sort of internal critiques or even challenges from the right or the far left. Because hey, if you challenge us now, if you challenge us in 2016 in October or June or May, that could lead to the apocalypse. And so this is a general condemnation of our larger political culture that is it's very reactive, it's very crisis oriented, and it's not very proactive or future oriented, or even we have yet to be able to compellingly integrate the idea of politics into our everyday life, into our everyday discourse. It's viewed as something separate from our lives.
So then, is there something to be said for the idea that, one upside of being in the Trump era is that it has heightened people's sense of being immersed in politics on an everyday basis? Maybe it's sort of a crisis. Maybe the way that they are engaging in politics now is in this sort of like crisis mode, but perhaps that's better than just not being involved at all and just being detached. So I wonder, is that an upside, or is it is it not actually producing anything that's worthwhile?
It depends on where we go from here, right? Like it depends because like this particular, like you said, crisis mode has revealed. Let me go, rephrase this. Like Trump, as an input into the American system, has produced some of the worst results, right? Like Trump is a revelation, insofar that he's shown us how bad a lot of, or rather the worst qualities of a lot of our institutions that we relatively neutral about. We talk about crises,
Including
right?
his opposition, right? I mean, he's showing the worst qualities of the people who oppose him in a lot of respects.
In what sense do you mean?
Well, I mean, he exposes to them the worst qualities of the institutions which fail to stop him, right? But he also has kind of amplified some of the worst pathologies of like the quote unquote resistance who are now opposing him, where they use sort of like lazy thinking. They have adopted sort of like mindless hawkishness in a way, just because they feel like that's the best means of opposing Trump. So I mean, there are certain good aspects of the resistance that's come about to oppose him, but because he's such a dominant figure, he's also sort of, I think, amplified maybe the darker elements of that resistance. You haven't observed that?
No, I have, but I think that speaks to like, and this is a more this is what I'm going to say is going to incorporate a lot of stuff that we've probably seen, whether it be Russia or support of the deep state. There's a vested interest from various aspects of our society, most of which who control levels of power, be Republicans, generally Republicans, Democrats, or even just your everyday rank and file. I don't know what they call themselves now, like liberal centrist voter, to pretend as though Trump came from nowhere. To say like, there is no historical precedent for Trump. He has no contemporaneous sort of context for him. He exists on this political island, and he just one day he was just president, and no one knows how it happened. Really, insofar as no one can like chart his genealogy to Trump. It's like at best the best we get is aggrieved working class white males, aggrieved Southerners who are just voting mindlessly and racially, and that just want to destroy the country. That's the best analysis we get. And so there, like that, what you're describing there is what it seems to be. Is there is this cognitive load that it would take for liberals to understand, like, well, here's how we got here. Like this, I say liberals, I use liberal and resistance and centrist interchangeably in sometimes, which I know pisses people off, but like, so I'll say resistance. No, because like they can self-define themselves. Like, I'm like, there is a desire amongst those in the
Well, I
resistance
mean,
to
the
pretend.
people who self-identify with the notion of resistance overwhelmingly tend to be on the center left. So I think that's fair.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll call them centrist, right? Like there is this overwhelming desire present in centrist and resistance, rank and file, to pretend as though Trump came from nowhere.
Or
And
everything was hunky dory prior to Trump, and if only Hillary had gotten 85,000 more votes and won, everything would have all these societal problems now which have manifest wouldn't have been observable.
yeah, Trump, like everything was fine until Trump, right? And so part of understanding that is not true would be reckoning with the fact that everything was not fine, that they were so disconnected from the rest of America society that they just missed it. It was like the writing was plain on the wall. Like there is this clear path towards Trump that a lot of people just miss because their section of society is homogenous in a lot of ways, like homogenous in thought and homogenous in class.
And they missed it
And
because they were complicit in giving rise to those factors. I mean, so if your homogenous class is involved in, you know, is clustered around New York City or Washington D.C. or Los Angeles or San Francisco, and you don't on a day to day basis have any awareness of these other socioeconomic demographics which ended up supporting Trump, then your non awareness of those trends represents complicity in the factors which gave rise to Trump. So you're not going to want to include your own cultural cohorts complicity in any broader critique. So you're kind of like insulating yourself from condemnation by living in sort of by taking this kind of surface level interpretation of what's going on now and saying if only Hillary had gotten 85,000 more votes and won, then none of these societal ills would have come about.
yeah, like everything was fine, and then Trump happened. Like Trump, and there, what helps with this, with that narrative, what helps is to support Trump's enemies blindly, right? The Republican, if Republicans don't support him either, it helps you believe that he has like there is no context for him, right? The deep state doesn't support him, Republicans don't support him, and of course Republicans don't support him. Have taken up the process, especially people like McCain, of rhetorically, cajoling him, for his tweets or his lack of professionalism, and then just supporting everything he does anyway, right? Which allowed them that sort of plausible deniability of, oh yeah, no, we don't support him, so that one day, if Trump ever goes down, it can be as though they were like, they can be rewarded for their, I don't know, what do you call it, integrity in standing up to their own president.
Yeah, well, I mean, McCain is back in the news right now because last night he engaged in some just pretty jarring theater. I mean, did you see when he sauntered onto the Senate floor and he was giving his vote on the healthcare skinny repeal, so-called legislation, and he held out his hand and like left his hand outstretched for a moment of dramatic suspense, and then gave a thumbs down and said voted no, and then
But
thereby killing the
like a
repeal.
like a Roman emperor.
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much like in the Gladiator movie when the the emperor gave a thumbs down and consigned somebody to death.
The only thing notable about John McCain is his ability to make everyone think that he is actually some sort of maverick in his PR. Like everything else about John McCain is entirely just like bog standard Republican, if not worse than the normal Republican, because he is such a hawk. It's like McCain.
Well, I mean, so he did defy, in a very stark way, the leadership of the Republican Party yesterday in voting against this so-called skinny repeal bill and basically killing Republican efforts to repeal Obamacare. So I don't know if so McCain definitely I don't think does not deserve the so-called maverick status, but he does. And what's ironic is when he does defy his party, it seems to be more for just petty political reasons than any kind of principled reasons. So if you go back around 2002 when George W. Bush had won, and George W. Bush defeated John McCain in the 2000 Republican primaries, and George W. Bush proposed a big tax cut, and McCain ended up opposing that tax cut, and that was seen as vindication of his so-called maverick status, right? But then fast forward, 5 or 6 years, McCain's running again in the 2008 Republican primaries, and he backs Bush's tax cut. So it would seem that his reasons for opposing the tax cut initially in 2002 were born of petty kind of personal grievances. And that may well have been also why he opposed this healthcare repeal legislation. I mean, was it because, Trump had slighted him so many times and said he wasn't a war hero? Was it because Um, the Democrats were especially nice to him. Chuck Schumer broke down in tears in lauding the heroism of McCain. I think Trump, McCain. The nuance here is that McCain actually has demonstrated willingness to defy the Republican Party orthodoxy at times, but it doesn't seem to have been for any principled reason. It's just for sort of petty personal stuff.
Oh no, exactly. Like McCain is just incredibly petty, and he has a hero complex. And like if McCain actually did not want this thing to be go through in the first place, he could have stayed his ass in Arizona, right? It's like he didn't have to fly back on taxpayer money to to vote for to allow the debate to go forward. Like he could have just stayed there, but like he wanted all eyes to be on him. And in some ways, he's been mildly successful in that, which is kind of disgusting, right? Like he's been mildly successful he's been mildly successful in drawing all of the attention from activist groups like Adapt and people who have been willing to get arrested, and knocked out of wheelchairs onto himself as this sort of hero of the resistance now. He's now, and that's one of the most dangerous aspects of Trump as well. That anyone who opposes him is suddenly just sort of has all of their sins washed away.
Right. So
Yeah.
James Comey has all his sins washed away now. He's a hero. The various rogue elements of the CIA apparently who don't want to follow his orders, including John Brennan, who went to the Aspen Ideas Fest and explicitly encouraged the rank and file of the CIA to defy and disobey the democratically elected president, take it upon themselves to basically affect their own policy. I mean, that's heroic at this point. McCain is heroic. I mean, if Sessions ends up getting fired, I'm sure he'll be adopted into a heroic
If
martyr figure as well.
if Session if Sessions ends up getting fired, he'll be on Ellen within a week of dancing.
Yeah.
It's just like it's like he'll be dabbing on Ellen,
Yeah.
and and it's like that is a very it's a stark condemnation of the kind of politics that we have, where a dude can essentially one dude, John McCain, can drag America through this showmanship just to get all eyes on him, all attention on him, and what kind of becomes lost in that narrative is that this is life and death for thousands of people a year, millions of people in the end. These things are life and death, and ultimately, we have, and that's why I say the crisis narrative has become such a key component of our electoral process, and it does turn people away. Like voting is down, like overall voting has been down.
Yeah.
That's what crisis does to you. It leads to fatigue. Like you can't, Americans just don't seem to be ready for sustained engagement with what their state is like. And so that's why I say, people say that Trump is in fact incredibly draining, and he is. It's like nothing I'm saying here is meant to distract from the fact that Trump is an incredibly petty, cynical, and craven individual.
And having him be in the office that is the most powerful office in the world is just
Disconcerting.
It's not just disconcerting; it's exhausting. It's exhausting to have to like wait every day for whatever the next insane tweet is going to be, because I think there's an excess focus on the tweets in cable news and the media, but at the same time, a tweet that has the imprimatur of the President of the United States is significant for any number of reasons, and that we're all hostage to his tweeting impulses now is just crazy.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I mean, I try to ignore it. I really do, but then sometimes it. And sometimes it's not even the important tweets that are like just craven and gross, like the banning trans people and the military tweets. Sometimes it's just like the incredibly, which again is gross and awful, but sometimes it's just like the childish ones, like what was it? I can't pronounce the word, like Kofreva that he tweeted out, and then
Yeah.
and then he said
Kofefi, or I think it's pronounced.
and then it was just like, and I was like, okay, whatever. I just ignored it. But then the response tweet from him was just like, I can't wait for libs to figure out what that means. I was like, fuck you. I was like, you're so childish. But the problem with that too is that Trump, by being that childish, by being that that out of the norm and anomalous in certain ways rhetorically, he's able to erase like these larger power structures, for which he's largely just a puppet of sometimes. They're like, yeah, he's like, stuff, like some of the stuff that he does is completely abnormal, but some of the stuff like, sanctions, I'm sorry, not sanctions, but bombing Syria is just, that's just military industrial complex 101. And when you position Trump by nature of his rhetoric and his sort of awful craven personality as this irrational single actor, it really has that effect of like erasing the entire military industrial complex, erasing the entire Republican Party, like absolving them in certain ways of their decades and decades of complicity and getting us to Trump.
Yeah, and I think the Republican Party. I mean, the congressional Republicans have really been the driving force behind this effort to repeal, replace, and do whatever else to Obamacare that's consumed the legislative agenda for the last 6 months. I mean, that's not really been so much Trump. I think Trump just outsourced his legislative agenda
Yeah,
to them. But now you have a
definitely.
weird thing. Like, so people adopt the word Trump care, which I mean, fine if if that galvanizes oppositional energy, fine. But I mean, I think it would be more accurately called, McConnell care or Ryan care. I mean, those are the people who are actually pushing this agenda, and to tie it all kind of like exclusively to Trump, I think misses where the actual power resides in terms of setting the Republican Party's agenda. I mean, Trump, if anything, is just seen by Republicans who run the Congress as sort of useful instrument for enacting their agenda.
Yeah, definitely, and distracting from the fact that it is in fact their agenda. In a lot of ways, Democrats feed into that narrative by still sort of relying very heavily on the idea of this rational Republican, this reasonable Republican who's going to stand up to Trump or to the Republican Party's, largely just their interest to have us all working in the Amazon lithium mines slash Whole Food quinoa plantations, and within the next 20 years. Like, but those people don't exist, right? So Trump acting as the foil for basically all of the institutional problems that we have, both for Republicans and for Democrats, like in some ways, it just further cements their control of the two. I'm sorry, it just further cements this two-party system in our country, like that. That Trump somehow exists outside two-party system, but then, like you said, Trump care could not be more, you know, rank and file standard GOP unless it also declared war on a random brown country. That's the only way this could be a more GOP bill. It's like, oh yeah, okay, we have Trump care.
Yeah, well, you know what was ironic? I mean, if you look at the actual final version of the bill that McConnell introduced at 10 p.m. last night, Eastern Time, to be voted on at midnight, which, by the way, is procedurally just one of the most insane things that's ever happened in the Senate. So the idea that the Republicans could have any procedural complaints, which are almost always pretextual anyway, in the future, has just sort of been evaporated. But if you look at the final version of the bill, I mean, it preserved the Medicaid expansion. I mean, it gave a lot of concessions to Democrats. So, in a sense, it was a little bit of a deviation from just kind of standard fare Republican politics. If anything, the House version of the bill was more so that. So I don't know what that means necessarily, but to me, it was just very telling that even with these concessions, and it seemed like I'm not hugely into the details of healthcare policy. It's just not my forte. But from what I gathered, it looked as though this iteration of the bill that McConnell finally introduced, um, it would it had the effect of destabilizing like commercial individual market healthcare while almost preserving the government provisioned functions, healthcare functions. So it was ironic that this would be coming from the Republican Party, and yet they still couldn't get it passed. So maybe the Trump effect, and this is something that I've been considering, perhaps having Trump. So on the one hand, Trump is seen as as a way to instrumentalize the standard fare Republican agenda. But on the other hand, I think if you had any other Republican than Trump in the presidency at this point, they probably could have gotten something passed on healthcare because I think Trump is a disruptive force within the Republican caucus. I mean, he's basically he's elevated the aspects of the Republican coalition which are friendlier to government services in like the priority hierarchy of the party. So, Senator Capito from West Virginia was very concerned about what the Republicans might do to help to Medicaid in her state. You had Dean Heller of Nevada voicing similar concerns. Um, I just think Trump, while in some respects he is basically just furthering the standard Republican agenda, he has sort of scrambled where the priorities lie in the GOP, and I think that's complicated their ability to actually get anything done legislatively. Whereas if you had a President Rubio or a President Jeb Bush or a President somebody else right now, it probably would have been a smoother process for them to kind of unite the Republican caucus and get something passed.
So I agree. And I think that, as a human being, instinctually, this might be, be just controversial. Probably as a human being, instinctually, uh, Trump probably has a better position on healthcare than the GOP establishment. Like as a human being, and as his path indicates, he wanted to move. Single payer was something that he was interested in, and so I do think that in a certain sense, like calling this Trump care is an incredible distraction because you know Trump would probably be open to single payer if you get the right people in front of him. But insofar that he complicates the GOP's agenda, it depends. It depends on what that agenda is. I think that when it comes to healthcare, the GOP sets for themselves the complicated task of essentially repealing a bill that didn't exist. It was all fun and games voting symbolically to repeal Obamacare, whatever they were, selling that as. When they knew that once they got to Obama, it would be repealed or vetoed rather. Sorry, but now that they actually have basically, the entire kit and caboodle to get it done, like it's like we're seeing that really it was all just a political maneuver. It was a very cynical and craven political maneuver to in fact just drum up their own like the worst parts of their base.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you had a President Rubio or a President somebody else right now who wasn't doing erratic tweets every day and who actually had a better sense of how to utilize the bully pulpit and who had robust relationships with elements with the Republicans in Congress, I think it's not difficult to imagine them having a more streamlined legislative process that wouldn't have been fraught with such disarray. And in that case, maybe would have actually been able to get this bill enacted. I mean, we should take a step back and think about how insane it is that the Republicans, who have been beating this drum incessantly for 7+ years, cannot figure out a way to actually repeal the thing that they said they wanted to repeal every single day since 2010. And I think the fact of Trump being in office, just because given his overall disruption and his overall volatility, I think has probably hindered the Republicans' ability to actually get their agenda through, at least much more so than it would have been if they had a President Jeb Bush in there.
I don't think the Republicans have an agenda, so to speak of. I don't think Republicans as a party as it stands today is a legitimate political party in the sense that I don't think they have plans for how to actually enact legislation that is in the favor of the public good. I think they know in certain ways how to drum up support for themselves, if though that's the case. And that's why I said I think, the Obamacare repeals were largely performative and symbolic. They were, we don't want, like, we're trying to keep big government from, having a say in your life. We want to keep regulations out of the way of you and your doctor, all other things, but they were meaningless, right? I think those talking points largely were meaningless. And the Republicans erected this, just like they erected, a false Obama to rail against, like this socialist Muslim Kenyan Obama who was taking your guns and trying to impregnate all white women with black babies. That there was also a phantom Obamacare that didn't really exist.
Yeah.
And so now that they're actually being tasked with repealing the real Obamacare, the thing that people like, and they like it because for the same reason you'd like single payer, because it takes away some uncertainty as it comes to, well, here's what's going to happen if I get sick. I won't lose my health. I'll have access to the doctor. Now it comes time to actually take that away from people. But, oh, well, so insofar that I think they'd have a streamlined process, I don't think, Murkowski, Collins, McCain, I think that, well, maybe McCain, but I think that they could pass it if there were no political consequences for this. Like if they could do it and not be at risk of losing their seats, they'd probably do it. But as it comes down to, and this is the issue with raising these people up as heroes, they had to be begged. People had to like, this is if someone wrote a dystopian novel in 1950s where people were forced to call up their elected representatives and beg them not to kill them, and only for at the end of that for them to say, okay, well, we're not going to kill you, and people go, oh, these are heroes. No, this is the Fellowship of the Ring. McCain is Gimli, and I guess Collins is. I actually don't like Lord of the Rings. It's a bad analogy, but like that would be viewed as too on the nose, like for it to be effective satire. But that's where we're at right now. Like we're at that position.
Yeah. Speaking of the valorization of McCain, another happening in the Senate yesterday that didn't get as much attention was the passage of the Senate of this sanctions bill. And if you look at the floor speeches which preceded the vote, there was one very telling moment where, again, Chuck Schumer got up and praised McCain for being who the sanctions idea originated with. So, according to Schumer, the idea for these Russia sanctions, which then got coupled with Iran and North Korea sanctions, originated with McCain and Graham. And Schumer was touting the embrace of the priorities of McCain and Graham as this stunning bipartisan triumph, which should give everybody renewed faith in the virtue of the Senate as an institution. So the valorization of people like McCain and Graham, and the valorization of anybody who seems to have like an anti-Russia stance at the moment as somehow good because they have interests that countervail Trump's, is actually having a real detrimental real world impact, I think. I mean, there was so little dissent about the wisdom of these sanctions in the entire Congress that it's just incredible. I mean, not one Democrat voted against the package in the House. And Bernie Sanders did vote against the ultimate bill, but he rushed to make sure everybody knew that while he had concerns about the Iran sanctions, he was very much in favor of the North Korea and Russia sanctions. So you didn't have anybody questioning the logic of the Russia sanctions, and I think that has to do with the fact that they don't want to get it spun as somehow defending Trump and or Putin, and that's just the climate that we're in now, and it's really really disconcerting.
Well, yeah. So I mean, let's break that down because there's a lot to unpack there. Now, and we'll start with the McCain aspect of it. And for me, you called McCain a war hero earlier in this
Did I?
discussion, and I mean, you said people would consider him a
I
war
think
hero.
people
I,
people
I
tout
yeah.
him as heroic. I don't think I called him a war hero, but yeah.
Oh no, oh no, no. You said Trump made fun of him for being a war hero,
Oh well,
but
Trump made fun
because
of him for not being a war
yeah,
hero. He said he doesn't
because
like it.
he was
Yeah, right,
captured.
right.
I don't like that was oh god, that was a rough time. But no. And so like part of this is understanding that sanctions are a tool of imperialism, right? And functionally there is not there is no non-imperialist party in America, especially not at the federal level. Because part of imperialism, or rather the way imperialism gets sort of masked nowadays is, human rights, humanitarianism, things like that. And, similarly, as part of this larger, broader umbrella of American exceptionalism. Like, American exceptionalism is the narrative, how they're exceptional, that they're always interested in spreading democracy, or rather, they have a unique claim to democracy, human rights, all these other things around the world. And so, this idea of, McCain as a war hero, or rather, in order to even start not that you have or I have, but like that the media seems to be holding up towards, right? As this war hero who's always interested in human rights and spreading democracy. Part of actually, and this is what makes critiquing McCain so difficult, especially on this, his legacy, is that part of critiquing McCain, like a legitimate critique of McCain's legacy as not a hero, would be a critique of America's position. I mean, sorry, geopolitical position in the world, which is as an imperialist nation. as a nation that is spreading aggression for a variety of reasons, and that the stuff that we do overseas is not us stumbling into conflict with Iran, or stumbling into conflict with North Korea, or tripping. There's like this clumsy actor on the world stage that always has good intentions, but actually as a pretty bad faith actor as it terms to destabilizing countries in the Middle East. In terms of Russian sanctions, like, there are so many different vested motivations for why this thing is happening, and why it's getting so blown out of control. Like, it's actually kind of interesting to me. So I mean, we know that the Republicans, they're just they're neocons. Like, they're neocons. They have financial interest in in the military industrial complex, and they're Russophobes. Like McCain is a Russophobe. Like, along with his his this desire to be hawkish. The Democrats have a separate, at least in my calculations, have a vested interest in, you know, keeping this Russia narrative going in order to escape any sort of reflection as, for why they lost. Like, this portrayal of Russia as the sole reason for why Trump won. And I think, I'll say this, I'll foreground this too, that I know there does need to be investigation. Like, Mueller needs to be doing his job. It shouldn't be a tent pole of the Democrats' political strategy, but it's what should be done. But if you think that these sanctions or the response to what's going on is based entirely in national security and not some sort of desire to escape blame, I just disagree.
Yeah, I think it's true that neither party is predominantly anti-imperialist. I think that's obvious, but there are elements of the Democratic Party which at times have been sympathetic to anti-imperialist agenda items. But now it's almost politically untenable for them to apply that analysis to anything involving Russia, because it immediately gets construed as being pro-Trump or defending defending Putin. And the narratives around this issue are so built up at this point, so fortified, that it's too much of a political risk for any Democrat to put themselves out there and question the utility of, say, Russia sanctions, because it opens them up to attack from the entire Democratic allied media ecosystem. It opens them up even to a potential primary challenge, if because that's how
Yeah.
high up on the agenda that this is for a lot of the party. So I think that's just a
I mean,
destructive dynamic.
I agree, and so I mean that's why I think that understanding what the Russia collusion issue as one of solely national security and election integrity is to not do enough justice, and you really need to understand Russia as an analogy for the Democratic Party and how it's been it's how it's being mobilized in these spaces to garner control, to garner authority within these spaces. Like, we've seen the rise of conspiracy grifters on Twitter, reach relatively mainstream infiltration, ending up on what, like, I guess Bill Maher, having retweets by Joanne Reed. And, of course, I'm talking about Louise Mitch. It's like we've seen how the Russia narrative has become a very good way to show your allegiance to the Democratic Party, and specifically the Democratic Party establishment. And again, as we talked about earlier, Russia is a very good way of positioning Trump as the foreign, as something as foreign, that's something that happened, not that's something that is Trump is uniquely un-American, and that is a very psychologically, I don't know what you'd call it, psychologically soothing narrative for the resistance, that Trump is not American. Like, Trump is not something that would happen to America but for foreign intervention, but for foreign interference, but for foreign influence. I mean, I've yet to hear a coherent narrative from the mainstream media about what Russia did specifically and how it affected things. But I mean, I could have missed it because there are so many just vague stories about there, ranging in plausibility. So I think Russia, like, what makes the Russia thing so dangerous is that so many people have so many different motivations for seeing it escalate or not de-escalating it, and they're not simply just political. They're also just about, like, emotions and psychology, and those sort of complex human issues, where, like, to accept that Russia maybe did not influence our election is to accept that America could elect Trump. to accept that we live in a country that that could lead to the election of Trump, and that he is in some ways uniquely American. He's a uniquely American phenomenon.
Yeah, and we're at a point where literally nobody who is an elected member of Congress and is a Democrat is questioning this current escalation. I mean, this is a classic kind of Cold War-esque escalation in hostilities. It's been reported that if Trump signs the sanctions bill, which I think he probably will, or even if he doesn't, he'll get overridden because there's a veto-proof majority. Um, there's going to be a tit for tat where Russia is going to respond with sanctions of their own of some kind, and this is just kind of the same Cold War gamesmanship that theoretically, at least Obama told us years ago that we were supposed to be beyond this, and nobody steps back to question it because the domestic political incentives all militate in favor of taking a hard line against Russia, and uh, the lack of just a creative thinking on the part of Democrats with regard to this issue, I think, is very telling, and it's maybe even a product of what we were talking about earlier. This kind of crisis mentality where people have such a short term view of things now. They can't step back and contextualize things and think about the longer term ramifications.
I would. So okay, so I think that's another good thing to bring in here, right? That our politics have become so abstracted from their actual real world effects that the idea of ramping up tensions with Russia as being something other than an issue of gamesmanship or an issue of like political or social maneuvering is kind of escapes people, right? Like, we talk about people being afraid of an atomic war and all other stuff, but that actual reality, it seems to be escaping people, and it's not just as it comes down to to Russia, like Russia influence. Like our politics in some ways have become, and people talk about Trump as the reality show president. It's like our politics have become a lot of, and we're already, Obama set the stage for that, right? Like in some ways, the way Obama was one of the first, or rather the pinnacle of celebrity president, insofar that the politics of Obama were almost entirely divorced from their material consequences, whether they be his foreign policy or his domestic policy. And so now we are at a point in our society where you know politics tends to have this weird exist in this weird space apart from you know where people don't see it as actually having any effects on their material realities. Like, celebrity politics, abstract politics, like they're just things that occur on TV, but they don't really have any effect on our material reality. So like the idea of us actually getting into a war where or and not even a war, but having the repercussions for our actions that are felt materially is just not something that Americans are used to thinking about when it comes to politics.
Yeah, and I want to just comment on you brought up Louise Mensch, and I could just see what the objection is would be to your bringing up Louise Mensch. Some like generic Democrat who's on board with the Russia narrative would say, yes, Louise Mensch is kind of bonkers, but she doesn't represent the kind of mainstream view of what the Russia narrative is. So you singling her out, it's just a way to discredit everybody who has reasonable concerns about Russia. Well, okay, Louise Mensch is kind of just uniquely unhinged and ridiculous, but if you look at the worldview she's expounding, it really is only one or two steps removed from just the generic Democrat worldview at this point. Meaning, Russia, interfered, quote unquote, and and the use of the word interference bothers me because it's purposely vague, and
Yeah.
it purposefully is intended to have a very expandable definition which could encompass so many different things. I mean, there are people who, when they talk about interference, mean Russian trolls on Twitter. I mean, that constitutes interference in their minds. I mean, this has been talked about in the Senate. Um, so I don't like these kind of Orwellian terms that are used to describe what is being alleged here. But I mean, the thing is, I mean, Louise mentions might be the most extreme example, but what she's putting forth has been adopted by huge swaths of the political establishment, maybe with less of a conspiratorial tinge than hers. But still, I mean, that's a material effect of this Russia story and its dominance in the political culture at the moment. And my stance on the Mueller investigation has always been, I have no objection on principle to investigating Trump on anything. I mean, if you can ferret out some kind of financial malfeasance that he or his family or his like real estate empire have been involved in, more power to you. But it was always obvious to me that having an investigation of this kind was going to end up dominating again the political dialogue, and it was going to have a lot of distortive effects, and it was going to breed a lot of paranoid thinking. And I think that's probably been borne out.
Yeah, I mean, so I single out Louise Minch because she's hilarious, but also because like, yeah, she goes out of control with it, right? Like she takes it to like the extreme. But what she's exemplary, what she's an example of, is the idea that Russia and parroting this Russia narrative and in some ways coming up with more and more extreme versions of it is a way to gain power within these resistant spaces.
Yeah.
It's like the more you talk about Russia, the further you take it. Maybe there's a sort of uncanny valley here, or rather, diminishing returns point. But like the more you talk about this stuff, the more you drum it up, the more power you can negotiate for yourself in these spaces. So I say, we've mentioned. What about Rachel Maddow?
Yeah.
Like Rachel Maddow has seen the best ratings. Like, is she mainstream enough? At some point we have to acknowledge that this is not like that. This sort of language, this sort of rhetoric, is being used as to signify something, and it's not necessary, and that becomes dangerous because it's being divorced from its real world consequences. So you have Louise Minch. Yeah, she's a little bit batty, but she's threatening. Sending threatening tweets to Putin on Twitter, and the challenging him to game theory chess or some nonsense, and that's like that's like the extreme end of it, but she knows it will get her attention, and the fact that it can get her attention is, example of the problem.
I mean, look at Adam Schiff. I mean, he's the Democrats' leader with regard to this Russia issue in the House, and he's become a national star at this point. And he's on TV constantly. He's looked to as an authority on the Russia issue by aggrieved Democrats who want somebody to show them the light here. And just as a PR strategy, it's worked out amazingly well for him. I mean, he's probably the leading choice at this point to succeed Dianne Feinstein in the Senate should she choose to retire soon. I mean, he could parlay the profile that he's garnered as a result of the Russia story into actual political ascendance for himself. And I think it's interesting that if you look at the congressional district that Adam Schiff represents, it encompasses Hollywood. And I think it goes to show that, so a lot of the big Democratic donors live in his district. The people who all these candidates have to make a pilgrimage to in order to hold on one second, sorry. Okay, so Adam Schiff represents a district where a lot of these kind of high roller Democratic donors live, and apparently they're very happy with him. So I think that's kind of an indication that the Russia story is something which is viewed as incredibly important among a certain kind of rarefied element of the Democratic Party base, meaning the affluent resistance types who.
Yeah. Let's talk about that too, because I think that's really interesting, right? So I both anecdotally and polling, we know that this is not a popular narrative. My personal life, I've never heard anyone actually say, talk about Russia when they're talking about politics. I've never heard it come up. And we know, I think it was Gallup put out a poll where it's like, amongst the registered voters, like it doesn't even register as a blip, because in a lot of ways, as you said, Russia is a narrative that demonstrates a certain amount of privilege, right? That you can be worried about this issue that is in a lot of ways a little bit more ethereal, like ethereal concerns about the republic, about the sanctity of democracy, demonstrates a certain amount of privilege insofar that you're not worried about feeding your family, or whether you have clean water, or whether or not you can get a job,
or that you believe that American democracy was sort of sanctified in the first place.
That's actually my least favorite genre of op-ed that has come out since Trump won, which is like the Republic is dead now. Republic is dead now. Democracy is dead now. Op-ed that comes from either upper middle class. To be honest, like I can't even say white people, just upper middle class people, right? People who have been largely insulated from the effects of the recession, the effects of even if they're non-white, they're the effects of racism, the material effects of racism, the material effects of sexism,
And
and
insulated
so
from
for
the
them,
and
Trump is
insulated from the effects of the American warfare state as well.
yeah. Exactly. And so, it's these, and it makes you say, like, as a country, America, there has never been a point in American society where we've reached a point where, like, let's say, everyone who is eligible to vote is actually allowed to, right? Like, we never had a society where we weren't disenfranchising black people, we weren't disenfranchising women, we weren't disenfranchising, the Chinese, and like, or even felons. And now we've been kicking people off voter rolls for a long time too. And so, and I'm sorry, formerly incarcerated, not felons. And so, I think this idea that the Republic had this level of was so virtuous before Trump is such like is it's kind of hilarious. That, it shows you just how privileged people were to actually believe that. Like, could you imagine not being 13 and believing that America was spreading democracy around the world? Like, I can't.
And that's
but that's where we're
and that's
at.
what's so also so noxious about the Russian narrative is that it's mainstreamed this sort of that the kind of rhetoric that you outlined there, that America was this pristine democracy and then it was attacked by this nefarious foreign force,
Yeah.
it's just so common now that it hardly anybody even notices when politicians get up in public and say America was attacked by Russia. I mean, that's a very inflammatory statement, and I don't think that we have sufficient data at present to make that statement. But it's become normalized to say that we have to stand up again and fight back against these attacks on America, and
I mean, no, sorry to interrupt you, but like yeah, that is an issue, right? And this is like another one of my least favorite, rather, something I've noticed about the resistance Dems and a lot of people, and I guess also just Republicans too. From Republicans, is that a lot of these critiques of Trump are entirely based in this sort of coded imperialist language of American exceptionalism, right? I mentioned it briefly before, but like this could like I can't believe this is happening to America. I can't believe this America is no longer exception in the world. Like, it's no longer the world leader, and they don't understand how problematic that viewpoint is inherently.
no,
Right, that America was this
and I
sort
wrote
of
about this recently. I wrote about how Max Boot has been a big critic of Trump. He's been on TV, right, and he feuded with Tucker Carlson, and all the resistance people rushed to his defense. But Max Boot's central critique of Trump is that Trump is a poor steward of American empire, essentially. That he discredits American imperium. And if you look at the
yeah.
liberal critique of Trump, it's virtually indistinguishable from Max Boot's critique at this point. And that, I think, should be seen as extremely worrying to anyone, that liberals seem to be aping the principles set forth by these neoconservative intellectuals who never liked Trump, but because they're opposed to Trump, they're worth valorizing.
I mean, I mean, I remember they were always using different language, right? Democrats' excuse for imperialism was like, well, we're spreading human rights, we're spreading, American exceptionalism as, human rights, some vague notion of feminism, some vague notion of self-determination, some vague notion of, LGBTQ rights, like, broadly. That was the excuse for American exceptionalism that was coming from the left. And, in a lot of ways, it was just a new way of saying, like, we're spreading civilization. We're spreading civilization around the world in the form of democracy, in the form of freedom, which was the rights version of that narrative. But they've adopted the same rhetoric because largely they succumb to various degrees the same basic mentality, which is that you talked about the fact that Adam Schiff's the county Adam Schiff represents is mostly just rich people, right? So I think what we're seeing now is like what happens when the people who have the most economic and social capital are experiencing a certain level of hysteria and and in some ways a conspiracy, right? This is like conspiracy in the sort of the demonizing way, right? Like not like people are conspiring, but like they in some ways this is a conspiracy theory, but this is a conspiracy theory that's being had by the people who have the most control over our media, people who have the most control over our politics, and so everyone else who's on the fringes of that are going like, Flint doesn't have clean water. Can we talk like did Putin prevent Flint from having clean water? It's like
No,
because and like how
sorry to interrupt, but it's what's amazing about this
that's
is
fine.
that this is a conspiracy that originates with the center. So most conspiracy theories, I think, many conspiracy theories throughout history have like begun on the fringe and then percolate toward the center. Whereas this one started in the center. I mean, it started in the establishment. It started in the most mainstream media venues, and it percolated outward from there, which makes this conspiracy theory of a peculiar kind. And people are going to get mad when they hear me refer to it, or you refer to it as a conspiracy theory, but I think it really is a conspiracy theory. I mean, I would recommend everybody to listen to the latest podcast episode of Intercepted, which is the Intercepts podcast, and Glenn Greenwald hosted the most recent one, and he had on Masha Gessen, who is a Russian, an LGBT Russian woman who's been a staunch critic of Putin for years, and has studied Putin in depth. And she refers to this Russiagate theory as a conspiracy theory. I mean, there are aspects of it that might not be overtly conspiratorial, but the underlying thesis or theory, which says that Russia intervened to help Trump and got Trump elected and attacked democracy. I think that really is fundamentally a conspiracy theory, but it's repeated so ad nauseum in these establishment precincts that it's not recognized as such.
Well, I would say, like, when I say conspiracy theory, I mean an alternative explanation for events that seems to have less evidence than the mainstream interpretation of events. Like, so like the Russia thing, I'm not dismissing wholesale. I think there's a lot of smoke that could indicate, that there was actually some kind of, collusion in the general, very vague term. But at the same time, if you think that the amount of coverage and the amount of sort of fervor and the way people are clutching onto this narrative is entirely proportional to what people are, what people who are in know say happened, which is like what different between like trolls on Twitter and occasional like pro Bernie Facebook groups popping up. It's like I don't think that's the case. I think a lot of this is, comes down to, like you said, you can negotiate power within the Democratic Party establishment by, at least performative, at least and as a performance, paying tribute to the Russian narrative. And, in resistance circles, you can assuage your own personal guilt for not really being able to see this coming, or rather explaining it. You don't want to believe this big about your country. Imagine that, right? Imagine living your whole life thinking everything is fine, and the world is generally, because your friends are like a rainbow, because your friends look like the cast, the children from the Magic School Bus or the Planeteers, that the world is diverse and fine and great. And then one day you realize, you wake up and Trump is president, and every mainstream outlet you've been reading, all of your friends, all of your media, from SNL to MSNBC, have been telling you this is impossible. He's going to get slaughtered. Your friends have been saying this is impossible. He's going to get slaughtered. And then one day he wins, and suddenly you have to either contend with the fact that the America you think is not really America, or is more complex, or that there is there was a vast plan that was enacted by, malicious foreign agents. And, it may seem ridiculous that you would choose the latter because obviously, Occam's razor, or, a reasonable facsimile of Occam's razor. But in terms of like, it actually is just it's more palatable psychologically. It's more palatable socially. Like, and also it's also the magic bullet that people want. It's okay. Well, if we can prove collusion, Trump will be gone tomorrow. The day we prove collusion is the day that the FISA court sign a warrant.
Yeah.
Sorry, sign a warrant for his arrest, and they drag him off to, like, I don't
Or
know, Guantanamo or
the
the
marshal
Hague.
of the Supreme Court arrests him, I think is how it goes.
Yeah, of course, or whatever. I don't know. Ronald McDonald arrests him, and takes him to Guantanamo Bay,
And
uh,
he's in a cell with Fred Flintstone.
in the Hamburglar, right? So and then we have Pence and everything, everything returns to a sense of normalcy, right? And that has been, when you say Trump is a disturbance, that has been a lot of the language surrounding him, right? People treating Trump as this vague, chaotic element, he's just this agent of chaos. And once chaos is gone, at least we can get back to normalcy. But that really does sort of disrespect how many people's lives prior to Trump and how many people's lives after Trump, if you say we had a Pence or Ryan, would be materially just as bad.
Yeah. So we started this conversation talking about this mode of American politics now that is defined by this crisis-oriented lurching every other day, and to what extent that's making people fatigued, or to what extent that maybe has some upsides. And I think the biggest recent example of that was, and I think it's good to talk about this now, was the Don Jr. email that was portrayed as the smoking gun. And I think it's good because whenever a so-called smoking gun comes about, I think it's good practice to wait maybe a week and then reflect on it in hindsight and see if the fury which it occasioned was justified. Because in the moment, that was a massive story, right? People were flipping out about it. They thought it was a smoking gun. They thought it proved collusion, whatever. And I think now, in hindsight, the amount of attention that engendered seems pretty silly. Or it doesn't seem to be being at all proportionate with what was actually uncovered. And I think the fact that people are in this constant crisis mode made them primed to believe that this was actually some kind of smoking gun, when in reality, I think they were destined for disappointment.
Well, so yeah, I think that first of all, I just want to put this out there. I admire the Trumps for their commitment to dispelling the narrative that having a lot of wealth means you're competent and means that you're you're moral. Because that email was I got to be honest with you. Like I've been one of the toughest critics on the Russian narrative for the reasons I laid out. That it's a lot of this that's driving this is like political and psychological or psychosocial motivations. But like, had you asked me before it came out, did I think there was an email that essentially said, "Hey, would you like to collude with the Russian government?" And then that they would reply, "Yeah, sounds great." Sounds great. Which is more or less what people portrayed the email as. I would have thought you were crazy, but like these people are like catastrophically dumb. Like the Trump administration, like you can't really downplay enough. Like Trump and Trump Jr. and in some ways, like I was gonna say, yeah, that was definitely Sean Spicer, are catastrophically stupid. And so, but you got to understand, like there is an industry for this kind, for drumming up this kind of crisis. Like there really is. Like the media, and it's not limited to simply the Russia thing. Like there is that brand of liberal fake news that exists out there, right? And I hate to use that term, but where it's essentially the Trump administration has done something incredibly banal. Let's get up in arms around it. Or something incredibly banal that, because let's be honest, Americans don't have a sustained political culture the way they should, and so they haven't been paying attention for long to what happens under individual presidents. You never noticed occurred. And so we're going to portray it as though it's some sort of something unique to Trump, when it's just, what every president does. And everyone's getting up in arms about it. I'm going to get a few thousand retweets, a few 100,000 retweets. And then, by the time people realize that it's not a big deal, the 24-hour news cycle will have moved past it.
Right.
And I do think there is a certain amount of fatigue. And I think this, again, this is Trump as an input revealing how I don't know how dysfunctional our institutions actually are, where you could have this sort of cycle of, we're going to report on, you say the Don Jr. email, but I guess I always go back to like the Russians hacked the Vermont utility thing that the Washington Post put out,
Uh-huh.
where it's like, yeah, you put out this story, it gets hundreds of thousands of retweets and likes and views because it confirms what people think is going on, and then by the time you print a retraction, it doesn't make a deal. It doesn't make a difference anymore. It's people have moved past it. Like it's not important. And so insofar that the Russia thing goes, like I don't know, people need to start. I think again, so I'll say this about the Russia thing. It's a albatross of the centrist mind, and it demonstrates to me that there is still this faith amongst centrists and Democrats that the institutions will save them. Right, a key component of like centrist thought is that these institutions and the people who control them will in fact save them. Like from Trump, it's like Trump is this malicious foreign actor, and the deep state, the CIA, Congress, the police, FBI, they're going to save us from Trump. And,
They're literally looking at the
a lot
former
of this,
FBI director, Robert Mueller. I mean, he's supposed to be the savior now of these people. And the thing I've been trying to remind people of is, do you realize that this was the FBI director under George W. Bush? I mean, is that not relevant in terms of how fulsomely he should be heralded? I mean, it just seems insane that they're to pin your collective hopes for the revitalization of American democracy on George W. Bush as FBI director.
but it's not about democracy. It's just democracy as code for American values, as code for some measure of public civility and discourse, I guess. And that again is an albatross of the centrism. Like this idea that politics is as defined by civility, politics as defined by professionalism, politics as defined by some sort of vague notion of rationality. And Trump definitely isn't any of those things, and so he must be abnormal. And it's the refusal to look a little bit below the surface and go, hey, you know what? Like, let's actually parse it out intelligently. Like, let's examine where Trump is abnormal, where he is just the extension of an excess of the system that is capitalism, that is racism, that is sexism, that is all these things, and where is he just an average president? And then, like where is he just an average president? But all three of those things are being lumped into the abnormal. Everything is abnormal. This is not normal has become the catchphrase. But a lot of stuff that they're describing as not normal, it is. Like, it simply is normal. It's normal for everyone but this subsection of the population that has been largely insulated from it. And we talk about ICE. ICE has been shit for a long time. Yes, they've been emboldened and they've gotten way, way worse under Trump. But like, this is kind of what they wanted. Like, this is what ICE wanted.
Yeah, I mean,
and so we have
I don't have the data. I don't have the data in front of me, but it's interesting to me that people now make ICE out to be this, uniquely fascistic force that's come about due to the ascendance of Trump. But according to the latest data, I mean, ICE's deportation, the levels of people the levels of deportation have reverted to like back to whatever they were in 2013 or something. So, I mean, is that good? No, not necessarily. I mean, there's plenty of reason to object, but the idea that it's some incredible outlier, I don't think is right.
Well, ICE is a uniquely fascistic force. It's just not uniquely fascistic under Trump.
Right.
It's like
right.
it's always been that way. Right, like it's gotten worse. It's like, I mean, like they've definitely gotten more craven. But again, you have to question, like, have they gotten more craven? Or has their actions under Trump been given a new, more sinister tinge to them?
Yeah, I think.
And I think
it's probably.
I think they have also got. I think it might be a little bit of both, right? I don't know that they were actually like going into like cancer wards before Trump, but like maybe they were. That's a question I've never I never posed. But there does seem to be that
wasn't
element
nearly
to it.
as much attention paid to their day-to-day activities under under Obama, for example.
And so that's what, you talk about people getting fatigue under Trump, and it's just like I would put this forth. Maybe it's not so much Trump, although I think Trump has a big component of that. Like, maybe what is actually exhausting is keeping up with the American state and all of its its institutions, like, and how awful they actually are. It's like maybe the American institutions themselves, sometimes divorced from Trump, are exhaustingly awful. And it's easy to see that under Trump. But if Trump was gone tomorrow, would they change? Would they change in a fundamental way? And the answer is, ultimately probably not, right? And so that's why this liberal appeal, the centrist appeal to institutions to save us from Trump, comes across as quaint and naive to me personally. Because I'm like, well, these institutions gave us Trump. These institutions, in a lot of ways, are responsible for giving us Trump, and these institutions are what Trump is merely in excess of. Like, he's not the disease, he's a symptom. He is to the far, the extreme end of the system rhetorically, but not necessarily policy wise.
Yeah. All right. Well, why don't we leave it there? It's a lot to stew over, and thanks for having this discussion. I think it was interesting.
Oh, I had fun. Thanks for inviting
All right.
me.
Take care.